My name is Clarisse Johnson, and at 28, I thought I had finally found peace with being the family outsider. I built my career from scratch, working my way through graduate school in genetics and landing a position at one of Minneapolis's top forensic genealogy labs. I helped families find each other, reunited adopted children with birth parents, and solved mysteries that had puzzled people for decades. But sitting at our family's Thanksgiving table that Thursday evening, I realized some mysteries hit closer to home than I had ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dining room in our suburban Minneapolis home felt smaller than usual, the tension thick enough to cut with the carving knife Dad was using on the turkey. Kevin sat across from me, his third glass of wine making him bolder than usual. Mom bustled around, her nervous energy filling every corner as she adjusted the centerpiece for the fifth time. Dad carved in silence, his jaw tight in that way it got when he sensed conflict brewing. Before we dive into what happened that night, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches, because what I'm about to share changed everything I thought I knew about family. Kevin had been taking shots at me all evening, little comments about my gratitude for being saved from foster care, and jokes about how I should remember where I came from. It was his favorite game, reminding me that I didn't really belong here. Mom would shoot him disapproving looks, Dad would clear his throat, but nobody ever actually stopped him. When Mom asked us to share what we were grateful for, I kept it simple. I'm grateful for family, I said quietly, meaning it, despite everything. The people around this table had raised me, loved me in their way, given me opportunities I might never have had otherwise. Kevin's laugh was sharp and cruel. He leaned back in his chair, wine sloshing in his glass, and delivered the blow I'd been expecting all evening. You'll never be real family, Clarisse. Stop pretending you belong here. The room went dead silent. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. Dad stopped carving mid-slice. Even Kevin seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but his smirk remained, waiting for me to crumble like I had so many times before. But I didn't crumble. Something had shifted in me over the past few weeks, a certainty that had been building since I'd started questioning things that never quite added up. I reached into my purse with steady hands and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it deliberately in the center of the table next to the cranberry sauce. "Actually, Kevin," I said, my voice calm as glass, "I have something interesting to share about family." The envelope sat there like a bomb waiting to explode. I could see Mom's face drain of color, Dad's knuckles white around the carving knife. Kevin's eyes darted between the envelope and my face, confusion replacing his usual arrogance. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. All those years of being made to feel like a charity case, like I should be grateful for scraps of belonging, had led to this moment. "Open it," I said simply. The envelope sat untouched as the weight of possibility settled over our family dinner. Whatever was in those papers would change everything, and somehow, we all knew it. The turkey grew cold, the wine sat forgotten, and the carefully arranged normalcy of our Thanksgiving dissolved into something much more real and infinitely more dangerous. Kevin's hand moved toward the envelope, then stopped. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but he didn't touch it. "Is it?" I asked, my years of scientific training keeping my voice steady, even as my heart hammered. Looking back, the signs were always there, hidden in plain sight like genetic markers waiting to be decoded. Growing up in our modest colonial on Maple Street felt like living in two different families that happened to share the same address. There was Kevin's family, where achievements were celebrated and mistakes were forgiven with understanding smiles. And then there was my family, where gratitude was expected and belonging was conditional. I was 8 when Kevin got the bigger bedroom upstairs, the one with the window seat overlooking our backyard maple tree. "Kevin needs more space," Dad explained. When I asked why, Mom added, "Besides, honey, you should be grateful for what you have." That word, grateful, became the soundtrack of my childhood. Grateful for the smaller room, grateful for hand-me-down clothes while Kevin got shopping trips to the mall. grateful for family dinners where I learned to disappear into the wallpaper while Kevin regaled everyone with stories from his day. The family photos told the story more clearly than words ever could. In our formal portraits, Kevin always stood front and center, flanked by Mom and Dad's protective presence. I was positioned slightly to the side, close enough to be included, but far enough away to look like an afterthought. Even our Christmas morning pictures followed the same pattern. Kevin surrounded by gifts and attention while I sat in the periphery, clutching whatever modest present had been allocated to the adopted daughter. School became my sanctuary. While Kevin coasted through classes with C's that earned him praise for trying his best, I threw myself into academics with the desperate hunger of someone who had to prove her worth. My report cards came home covered in A's, but they were met with brief nods and comments about not getting a big head about my success. Kevin's mediocre grades were celebrated like Nobel Prizes, complete with dinner at his favorite restaurant and new video games. High school amplified everything. Kevin joined the football team and suddenly became the golden boy of Westfield High, despite spending more time on the bench than on the field. Mom and Dad never missed a game, cheering from the bleachers with the enthusiasm of parents whose dreams were being realized. I won the state science fair, earned a partial scholarship to the University of Minnesota, and made honor roll 6 semesters straight. My achievements were acknowledged with quiet pride and gentle warnings not to make Kevin feel bad about my success. The breaking point came junior year. I'd been accepted into an advanced genetics program, the first step toward my dream of studying forensic genealogy. The letter arrived on the same day Kevin got suspended for cheating on his chemistry exam. Guess which one dominated dinner conversation? Kevin made a mistake, but we all make mistakes, Mom said, stroking his hair while he sulked at the table. The important thing is he learns from it. I held my acceptance letter under the table, the words blurring through tears I refused to shed. That night, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I stopped seeking their approval. I stopped trying to earn my place at a table where my chair would always be slightly pushed out from the circle. Instead, I poured everything into understanding genetics, into learning how families really worked at the molecular level. I studied inheritance patterns and genetic markers, fascinated by how traits passed from parent to child in predictable ways. I helped classmates trace their family trees and explain concepts like dominant and recessive alleles. But the more I learned about genetics, the more questions arose about my own story. Kevin had Dad's exact shade of brown eyes and Mom's delicate hands. For someone who was supposedly adopted at age 2, the resemblances seemed remarkably strong. That's just coincidence, Mom would say whenever I mentioned it. Sometimes adopted children grow to resemble their families. It's like that saying about married couples looking alike after years together. I nodded and accepted the explanation, the way I'd learned to accept all the half-truths that kept our family functioning. But a part of me, the scientist part, that was trained to question everything, filed those observations away for future reference. Kevin's cruelty reached new heights during senior year. At my graduation party, a modest cake in our kitchen compared to his catered celebration the year before, he raised his soda can in a mock toast. "Here's to Clarisse for always remembering she's lucky to be here." The words stung, but they also crystallized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had my acceptance letter, my scholarship, and a future that belonged entirely to me. That fall, I'd leave Maple Street behind and build something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by family dynamics I never asked to be a part of. As I packed for college, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. The genetics program awaited, full of mysteries to solve and families to reunite. I had no idea I was about to embark on the investigation that would solve the biggest mystery of all, the truth about my own DNA and the lies that had shaped my entire life. The University of Minnesota campus stretched out before me like a promise of reinvention. For the first time in 18 years, I was somewhere where Kevin's reputation hadn't preceded me, where my worth wasn't measured against someone else's mediocrity. The genetics program was rigorous and demanding, exactly what I'd been craving after years of dumbing myself down to avoid making my adoptive brother look bad. My dorm room was a tiny sanctuary on the 7th floor of Comstock Hall, barely big enough for a bed, desk, and the enthusiasm I'd packed alongside my secondhand textbooks. My roommate was a pre-med student from Duluth who studied as obsessively as I did, so we coexisted in comfortable silence, broken only by the rustle of textbook pages and the scratch of pencils on paper. The forensic genealogy program was small, intimate, filled with students who shared my fascination with unraveling family mysteries. Professor Martinez, a brilliant woman who'd spent decades reuniting adoptees with birth families, became my academic North Star. She'd say, genetics tells stories. Every chromosome carries a narrative written in the language of inheritance. Your job is to learn how to read between the lines.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I threw myself into coursework with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been intellectually starved for years. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, autosomal inheritance patterns, the vocabulary of genetics became my native language. While my classmates struggled with Punnett squares and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, I devoured the material like it was oxygen. It was during my second semester that I met James Morrison in the campus coffee shop on a gray February afternoon. I was hunched over my laptop, analyzing genetic data for a class project, when he slid into the chair across from me. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that perpetually looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, and warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "That's beautiful work," he said, nodding at my screen, where I had mapped inheritance patterns across 4 generations of a family tree. Most people would have seen incomprehensible charts and numbers. James saw the artistry in the data, the elegant way genetic information painted family portraits across time. We talked for 3 hours, trading stories about late-night study sessions and the peculiar satisfaction of solving puzzles no one else cared about. James was working toward his PhD in computational biology, specializing in genetic algorithms. Where I worked with families and emotions, he worked with code and logic. But we shared the same fundamental belief that patterns held truth, that data could reveal secrets hidden in plain sight. Our first official date was to a lecture on genetic genealogy's role in solving cold cases. While other couples were seeing movies or sharing dinners, James and I sat in a university auditorium listening to a forensic geneticist explain how DNA had identified a serial killer after 30 years. When the lecturer described the moment the genetic match appeared on her screen, James reached over and squeezed my hand, understanding exactly why my breath had caught in my throat. "This is what you want to do," he said afterwards, as we walked across campus under stars that seemed impossibly bright in the crisp Minnesota air. "Yes," I said, and for the first time, my future felt completely clear. James's family embraced me with the kind of warmth I'd only imagined existed. The Morrisons lived in a rambling farmhouse outside St. Cloud, where Sunday dinners were chaotic affairs with 3 generations crowded around a table that groaned under the weight of homemade bread and stories that got better with each telling. Mrs. Morrison hugged me the first time we met, holding on just long enough to whisper, "Any girl who makes James light up like that is family to us." Mr. Morrison showed me his workshop where he restored antique furniture, his weathered hands gentle with both wood and words. James's sister Sarah included me in sister conversations, looping her arm through mine as we walked to the barn to visit the horses. The contrast with my own family gatherings was stark and painful. Where the Morrisons celebrated each other's successes without competition or comparison, my family dinners remained exercises in maintaining careful equilibrium. Kevin had followed Dad into the insurance business, a decision that earned him praise for being practical and family-oriented, while my academic achievements were acknowledged with the same polite interest reserved for distant relatives' vacation slides. My work in the genetics lab increasingly focused on adoption cases. There was something deeply satisfying about helping families find each other, about using science to heal rifts that had existed for decades. My first successful case involved a woman in her 60s who'd been searching for her biological mother since she was 18. The DNA evidence I compiled led to a reunion at the Minneapolis airport that left everyone in tears, including me. "You have a gift for this," Dr. Sarah Kim told me after that case. Dr. Kim was a brilliant geneticist who'd built her career on meticulous attention to detail and genuine compassion for the family she served. Working under her mentorship, I learned to navigate the delicate balance between scientific objectivity and human emotion. Every case taught me something new about the complexity of family structures, about how genetics could reveal unexpected connections while also highlighting the arbitrary nature of biological relationships. But the more families I helped reunite, the more questions arose about my own genetic story. Late at night in the lab, after finishing my official assignments, I found myself staring at inheritance charts and wondering about the gaps in my own family narrative. The story my parents had told, adoption from foster care at age 2 after a teenage mother couldn't care for me, had always felt incomplete, like a book with missing chapters. James noticed my growing preoccupation during our weekend study sessions. "You're thinking about something," he said one Saturday evening as we reviewed case files in his apartment. "Something beyond these charts." I set down my pencil and looked at him, this man that had become my anchor in ways I was still learning to appreciate. "Do you ever wonder if the story you've been told about your life is actually true?"
He was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of the question. "Are you thinking about investigating your own adoption?" The words hung between us, dangerous and thrilling. I'd spent months helping other people uncover genetic truths that had been hidden for decades. The irony that I'd never applied those same techniques to my own family wasn't lost on either of us. "I don't know," I said, but even as I spoke, I realized that wasn't entirely honest. The tools were at my fingertips, the knowledge was in my head, and the questions that had been growing since childhood were demanding answers. James reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "Whatever you decide, you know I'll support you. But, Clarisse, once you open that door, you can't close it again." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. In helping other families find truth, I'd seen how genetic revelations could heal decades-old wounds or create entirely new fractures. Whatever I might discover about my own story would change everything, for better or worse. As spring semester drew to a close and I prepared for my final year of graduate school, the questions about my genetic heritage became impossible to ignore. The scientist in me craved answers, but the daughter in me feared what those answers might reveal about the family that had raised me, flawed as they were. The tools of discovery were literally in my hands. All I needed was the courage to use them. By 28, I had built the career I dreamed of during those lonely nights in my childhood bedroom. The Gene Tech Laboratories building in downtown Minneapolis had become my second home, its sterile halls and humming equipment more familiar than the house on Maple Street. Working alongside Dr. Sarah Kim, I'd helped solve over 60 adoption cases, earning a reputation as one of the most meticulous forensic genealogists in the Midwest. The Hendricks case put me on the map. A 45-year-old woman searching for the daughter she'd given up for adoption 20 years earlier had hit dead ends with every traditional search method. The DNA analysis I conducted revealed connections across 3 generations, leading to a reunion that made the local news. The reporter called my work genetic detective work that reunites hearts. Kevin saw the news segment. He called that night, his voice dripping with the familiar condescension I'd grown up with. "Saw you on TV playing family matchmaker. Must be nice getting paid to fix other people's problems when you can't even figure out your own story." His words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Here I was, helping strangers unravel their genetic mysteries, while ignoring the questions that had been building in my own mind for years. The success that should have felt like validation instead highlighted how disconnected I felt from my own family narrative. Dr. Kim noticed my distraction during our weekly case reviews. "You've been distant lately," she said, her dark eyes studying me with the same intensity she brought to genetic sequences. "Something's bothering you." I trusted Sarah more than almost anyone, except James, but admitting my doubts about my own adoption felt like betraying the people who'd raised me. "It's probably nothing," I said. "Just some inconsistency as I've been noticing." "In your own family?" she asked, gently. The question hung in the air between us.
Sarah had supervised my work on dozens of cases where adopted children discovered unexpected genetic connections. She understood better than anyone how adoption narratives could be complicated by half-truths and well-intentioned deceptions. Family gatherings became increasingly difficult. Kevin had joined Dad's insurance agency, a move that earned him praise for being committed to family legacy. His success gave him new ammunition for his verbal attacks. At Mom's birthday dinner, he raised his wine glass in another mock toast. To Clarisse, who's so good at finding other people's real families because she knows what it's like to need one. The laughter around the table felt forced, but nobody called him out. They never did. Walking to my car afterward, I caught my reflection in the restaurant window and stopped. The woman looking back at me had Dad's exact shade of brown eyes. Not the kind of coincidental resemblance Mom claimed was common in adoptive families. My hands, resting on my purse strap, were delicate like Mom's, with the same long fingers and narrow wrists. For someone who'd supposedly been adopted at age 2 from an unrelated foster family, the physical similarities were striking. In my professional work, I'd learned to recognize when genetic resemblances suggested deeper connections than official paperwork indicated. James found me sitting in my apartment that night, staring at old family photos spread across my coffee table. "What are you looking for?" he asked, settling beside me on the couch. "Proof that I'm crazy," I said, pointing to a picture from my high school graduation. "Look at Kevin, then look at Mom and Dad. Now look at me." James studied the photo with the analytical eye that made him such a good computational biologist. Kevin stood in between our parents, his sandy hair and stocky build, a stark contrast to their features. I stood slightly apart. My dark hair and delicate bone structure echoed theirs perfectly.
"The resemblances are strong," he said carefully. "Too strong for coincidence," I whispered. He took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. "You know what you need to do. The question is whether you're ready to do it." I looked at the photos again, seeing them through the eyes of the forensic genealogist I'd become, rather than the grateful adopted daughter I'd been trained to be. Every case I'd worked had taught me that genetic truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it was buried. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt the clarity that came with making a decision I'd been avoiding. The tools were at my fingertips. All I needed was the courage to use them on my own family secrets. The decision to investigate my own genetics came after Kevin's worst attack yet. It was at Cousin Jennifer's wedding reception, a beautiful October evening at the Minnetonka Country Club. I'd been having a pleasant conversation with Uncle David about my work when Kevin approached, 3 drinks in and looking for trouble. "Must be nice having a job where you pretend to belong to everyone else's family," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Since you're so grateful for being rescued from foster care, maybe you should focus on that instead of playing detective." The words hit differently this time. Maybe it was the public setting or the way Uncle David's face tightened when Kevin mentioned foster care, but something shifted in me. I wasn't going to spend another family gathering being reminded of my supposed place on the outside. That Monday, I approached Dr. Sarah Kim in her office. "I need to run some genetic analyses," I said. "Personal ones." Sarah's expression was carefully neutral. "Are you sure you want to go down this road, Clarisse?" "I've been thinking about it for months. The inconsistencies in my adoption story, the physical resemblances, Kevin's constant need to remind me I don't belong. I need to know the truth." Sarah studied me for a long moment. "This is your family we're talking about. Once you have answers, you can't unknow them." "I understand the risks, but I'm a genetic genealogist. How can I help other families find truth if I'm afraid to face my own?" Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully collected samples. Hair from Mom's brush when I helped her organize her medicine cabinet, a water glass that Kevin had used during Sunday dinner, Dad's coffee mug that I volunteered to wash after he'd worked late in his home office. The collection process felt surreal, like I was conducting surveillance on the people who'd raised me. Each sample represented a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but couldn't leave alone. James supported my decision while expressing concerns about the potential consequences. "What if the results confirm what you suspect?" he asked one evening as we walked around Lake Calhoun. "Then I'll finally understand why I've never felt like I belonged in my own family, and maybe Kevin's cruelty will make sense. And if the results show you're wrong, if you really are adopted exactly as they told you?" I considered this. Then I'll have wasted some lab time, but at least I'll know for certain. Processing the samples took longer than my usual cases because I ran each test multiple times, checking and rechecking results. Dr. Sarah Kim reviewed my methodology, ensuring that my personal investment didn't compromise scientific accuracy. The waiting was excruciating. I found myself studying every interaction with my family through a new lens. Did Mom avoid eye contact when Kevin mentioned my adoption? Did Dad change subjects too quickly when questions about my early years came up? Were their explanations about resemblance really as plausible as I'd been taught to believe? James noticed my increasing anxiety. "You're losing sleep," he said, running his fingers through my hair as we lay in bed one night. "What if everything I've been told about my identity is no lie?" I whispered into the darkness. "Then you'll deal with it," he said simply. "You're the strongest person I know, Clarisse. You've built an entire career on helping people navigate exactly these kinds of revelations." His confidence in me felt like a lifeline. I'd spent so many years being made to feel small within my family that I sometimes forgot how capable I had become outside of it. 2 weeks later, Sarah called me into her office. The manila folder on her desk contained the answers I'd been seeking and dreading in equal measure. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever was in that folder would either confirm my suspicions or put them to rest forever. Either way, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance I'd lived with for 28 years. "Then let's see what your DNA has to say about your family." The fluorescent lights in Dr. Sarah Kim's office hummed softly as she opened the manila folder that contained my genetic analysis results. I'd sat in the same chair dozens of times, reviewing cases that would reunite other families or solve decades-old mysteries. But this time, my own identity hung in balance.
"I've run these tests 3 times to ensure accuracy," Sarah said, her professional demeanor not quite masking the concern in her voice. "The results are conclusive." She spread the genetic comparison charts across her desk with the careful precision of someone handling explosive material. The familiar patterns of DNA markers looked different when they mapped my own genetic story. "This first chart compares your DNA to Robert's sample," she began, pointing to columns of data that meant everything to me and nothing to most people. "These markers here indicate a clear parent-child relationship. You share approximately 50% of your genetic material, exactly what we'd expect between a biological father and daughter." My breath caught. I stared at the numbers, seeing in black and white what I'd suspected but feared to believe. "And this," Sarah continued, moving to the second chart, "compares your DNA to Linda's sample. Again, clear markers indicating a biological mother-daughter relationship." The room seemed to tilt around me. 28 years of being told I was adopted, 28 years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, and the scientific evidence was telling me I belonged there more than anyone had ever acknowledged. "What about Kevin?" I managed to ask, though I already suspected what the answer would be. Sarah's expression was grim as she pulled out the third chart. "Kevin's DNA shows no familial relationship to either Robert or Linda. No shared genetic markers beyond what we'd expect from random chance. Scientifically speaking, Kevin is not their biological child." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what Sarah was telling me. Kevin, who'd spent our entire childhood reminding me that I didn't belong, who'd weaponized my supposed adoption status to make me feel small and grateful, Kevin was the adopted one. "Are you certain?" I whispered. "Genetic evidence doesn't lie, Clarisse. These results are as definitive as anything I've ever analyzed. You are Robert and Linda's biological daughter. Kevin is not related to any of you. I stared at the charts until the numbers blurred through tears I didn't realize were falling. Every cruel comment, every reminder that I should be grateful, every time Kevin had positioned himself as the real child while making me feel like a charity case, all of it had been based on a lie. How was this possible? I asked. Why would they tell me I was adopted if I wasn't? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. In my experience, when families construct false narratives about adoption, it's usually to hide something else. An affair, an unplanned pregnancy, financial difficulties, family scandal. The adoption story becomes a cover for whatever truth they're trying to protect. My mind raced through possibilities. An affair would explain why Kevin looked so different from both parents. If Robert had fathered a child outside his marriage and Linda couldn't conceive at the time, they might have adopted Kevin to save their marriage. When Linda later became pregnant with me naturally, they might have maintained the adoption story to protect their secret. What do I do with this information? I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah reached across the desk and touched my hand gently. That's not a scientific question, Clarisse. That's a human one. You have to decide whether you want to confront your family with this evidence or keep it to yourself. I thought about Kevin's smirk at the wedding, his constant need to remind me of my place. I thought about my parents' careful way of changing subjects when my early childhood came up. I thought about Uncle David's uncomfortable expression whenever Kevin mentioned my adoption. They all know, at least some of them. That's why Uncle David looked so uncomfortable at the wedding. That's why Mom gets nervous when Kevin talks about my adoption. They've been keeping the secret for nearly 30 years. Secrets this big don't stay buried forever, Sarah said quietly. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially in families. I gathered the charts with shaking hands, carefully placing them back in the folder. The scientific evidence was irrefutable, but the emotional implications were staggering. My entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies, while the person who'd tormented me for being an outsider was himself the one who truly didn't belong. Take some time to process this, Sarah advised as I stood to leave. And remember, genetic relationships are just biology. Family is much more complicated than DNA. But as I walked to my car in the GeneTech parking lot, I knew there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance I'd lived with before. Kevin's next cruel comment would be his last. The truth was finally on my side, and it was time my family knew it.
The science is solid, Clarisse. You've verified it 3 times with Dr. Kim. The question now is what you're going to do with it. I'd been wrestling with that exact question since leaving Sarah's office. Confronting my family meant destroying the carefully constructed narrative they'd maintained for nearly 30 years. But staying silent meant continuing to let Kevin torment me with lies about my place in the family. I've decided to tell them at Thanksgiving, I said finally, when everyone's together, when Kevin can't hide behind private conversations or individual manipulation. James took my hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on my palm. Are you prepared for how they might react? Your parents have been keeping this secret for decades. Kevin's entire identity is built on being the real son. The thought terrified me, but I'd spent too many years being afraid of my own family's reactions. I'm tired of tiptoeing around their comfort while they let Kevin make me feel like I don't belong. That weekend, I decided to test the waters with the family members I suspected might know more than they'd admitted. Grandma Rose lived in a cozy apartment near Lake Harriet, her walls covered with family photos that suddenly looked different through the lens of genetic truth. Grandma, I said carefully as we shared tea and her famous snickerdoodles, do you remember when I was adopted? Her teacup rattled against its saucer. Why do you ask, dear? I've been thinking about my early years, trying to piece together memories, but everything before age 3 is so fuzzy. Grandma Rose set down her cup with deliberate care. You know, Clarisse, I always thought you looked remarkably like your father as a baby. Same dark eyes, same determined little chin. Mom always said resemblance was common in adoptive families. Did she? Grandma Rose's voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Well, mothers know best, I suppose. But her eyes told a different story. There was knowledge there, carefully guarded but unmistakable.
Uncle David was more direct when I visited him the following week. He was in his garage tinkering with an old motorcycle when I brought up the subject of family resemblances. You know, Uncle David, people often comment on how much I look like Dad. It's strange for someone who's adopted, don't you think? His wrench slipped and he cursed under his breath. Clarisse, some things are better left alone. What things? He straightened, his face troubled. Your parents have their reasons for the choices they made. It wasn't my place to interfere then, and it's not my place now. But you know something, don't you? Uncle David was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the tick of his old clock on the workbench. I know your father made some mistakes early in his marriage. I know your mother is a saint for forgiving him, and I know that sometimes families do what they think is best, even when it creates complications down the road. The pieces were falling into place. Dad's affair, Kevin's adoption, the false narrative about my origins to hide the truth about his. Uncle David's words confirmed what the DNA evidence had already proven. Kevin doesn't know, does he? Kevin doesn't know a lot of things. Neither do you, apparently. But, Clarisse, before you go stirring up 30 years of settled history, ask yourself if the truth is worth the damage it might cause. I understood his concern, but I also understood that some truths couldn't stay buried forever. Kevin's cruelty had been enabled by lies for too long. My sense of not belonging had been manufactured to protect someone else's secret. James helped me rehearse what I would say, how I would present the evidence calmly and scientifically. We practiced different scenarios, different reactions, different ways the conversation might unfold. Remember, he said the night before Thanksgiving, you're not doing this to hurt anyone. You're doing it to reclaim your place in your own family. What if they hate me for it? Then they were never the family you deserved anyway. As I placed the DNA results in my purse that Thanksgiving morning, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For 28 years, I'd been living someone else's version of my story. Tomorrow, I would finally tell my own. The drive to my parents' house felt different this time. I wasn't the grateful adopted daughter going to beg for scraps of belonging. I was their biological child, armed with scientific proof and tired of being treated like anything less than. Kevin's next cruel comment would be his last. The truth was finally ready to surface.
Kevin's hand moved toward the envelope, then stopped. This is ridiculous, Clarisse. What are you trying to prove? I'm not trying to prove anything, I said calmly. The science already did that for me. I reached across the table and opened the envelope myself, pulling out the genetic comparison charts that had changed everything I thought I knew about my identity. The numbers and graphs meant nothing to most people, but I'd spent years learning to read the stories written in DNA. These are genetic analysis results comparing my DNA to everyone in this family, I began, my forensic genealogy training keeping my voice professional despite the personal stakes. This first chart shows the comparison between my genetic markers and Dad's. I pointed to the relevant columns, explaining the science the way I would to any other family seeking answers. These numbers indicate a clear parent-child relationship, approximately 50% shared genetic material, exactly what we'd expect between a biological father and daughter. Dad's face had gone ashen. Mom made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. This second chart compares my DNA to Mom's, I continued, moving to the next page. Again, clear biological markers indicating a mother-daughter relationship. That's impossible, Kevin said, but his voice lacked his usual conviction. You were adopted. You've always been adopted. I looked directly at him, meeting his eyes with the calm certainty that came from scientific proof. According to the DNA evidence, Kevin, I'm not adopted. I'm their biological daughter. The words landed like physical blows. Kevin's wine glass slipped from his fingers, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Mom pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Dad slumped in his chair as if the weight of 30 years of deception had finally become too heavy to carry. "But if you're not adopted," Kevin said slowly, the pieces clicking together in his mind, "then who?" I pulled out the third chart, the one that would shatter his world the way mine had been shattered 3 weeks ago. "This compares your DNA to both Mom and Dad. Kevin, there are no shared genetic markers, no biological relationship whatsoever." The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and devastating. Kevin stared at the charts as if he could will them to say something different, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. "You're lying," he whispered, but even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. "Genetic evidence doesn't lie," I echoed Dr. Sarah Kim's words. "I'm their biological child, Kevin. You're the one who's adopted." The explosion came all at once. Kevin swept his arm across the table, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor. "This is insane. You're making this up. I'm their son. I've always been their son." "Kevin, please," Mom finally spoke, her voice broken and small. "Tell her she's wrong, Mom. Tell her I'm your real son and she's the adopted one." But Mom couldn't meet his eyes. She sat there crying, her silence confirming everything the DNA had already proven. Dad finally found his voice, rough and heavy with guilt. "Kevin, son, sit down. There are things we need to explain." "Don't call me son. Apparently I'm not your son, am I? Apparently everything I've believed about my life is a lie." He turned to me, his face twisted with rage and pain. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you? You had to destroy everything." "I didn't destroy anything. I just revealed what was already broken." James reached for my hand under the table, his steady presence anchoring me as my family imploded around the truth I'd finally spoken. Uncle David and Grandma Rose sat in stunned silence, though I suspected they weren't entirely surprised. Kevin stormed toward the door, then turned back, his eyes wild. 30 years! 30 years you let me think I belonged here while making her feel like an outsider. What kind of sick game is this? The front door slammed behind him, rattling the windows, and leaving the rest of us in the wreckage of our Thanksgiving dinner. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, at the center of my own family, no longer apologizing for taking up space that had always been rightfully mine. The truth was finally out, and despite the chaos it had created, I felt lighter than I had in years. The silence after Kevin's departure felt heavier than his shouting had. Broken glass glittered on the dining room floor, wine soaked into the tablecloth, and 30 years of carefully constructed lies lay shattered around us. Mom sobbed quietly into her napkin, while Dad sat with his head in his hands, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Someone needs to explain," I said finally, my voice cutting through the wreckage of our family dinner. "Right now." Dad lifted his head, his eyes red and hollow. "Clarisse, you have to understand, we never meant it for it to go this far." "How far did you mean for it to go? How long were you planning to let Kevin torment me for being adopted when you knew I was your biological daughter?" Grandma Rose spoke up from her corner of the table, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Robert, I told you this would come out eventually. 30 years of living a lie, and for what?" "For our marriage," Mom whispered, finally looking up. "For our family. Robert, tell her." Dad's confession came out in broken pieces, each word seeming to physically pain him. "I had an affair," he said simply. 31 years ago, when your mother and I were struggling to conceive. I was weak and stupid, and I hurt everyone I loved. The affair had resulted in Kevin's birth. The other woman couldn't care for a child, and Robert, desperate to save his marriage and make amends, convinced Linda to adopt the baby secretly. "We told everyone Kevin was ours," Dad continued, his voice barely audible. "It seemed like the perfect solution. I could take responsibility for my son, Linda could have the child she'd always wanted, and no one would ever know about my mistake. But then I came along," I said. the pieces finally falling into place. Mom nodded through her tears. 2 years later, I finally got pregnant naturally. We were so happy, so grateful, but by then, everyone believed Kevin was our biological child. So you decided to tell everyone I was adopted instead. It seemed easier, Dad said miserably. Kevin had been through enough upheaval in his early life. We thought it would be less damaging to let him keep his identity as our real son and create a new story about your adoption. Uncle David finally spoke up, his voice heavy with regret. I suspected something about the timing, but I stayed quiet. I should have said something years ago when I saw how Kevin treated you. You all knew, I said, looking around the table. All of you knew the truth, and you let Kevin spend 30 years making me feel like I didn't belong in my own family. Grandma Rose reached across the table and grabbed my hand. I always suspected, dear. You looked so much like Robert as a baby, and the timing never made sense. But it wasn't my secret to tell. Wasn't it? I pulled my hand away, anger flaring. Wasn't it everyone's responsibility to protect me from being emotionally abused based on a lie you created? The words hung in the air, harsh but true. I'd spent my entire childhood and young adulthood believing I was the outsider, the one who should be grateful for scraps of belonging, while the real truth was that Kevin was the one whose place in the family was built on deception. We thought we were protecting both of you, Mom said desperately. Kevin from the trauma of knowing about the affair, and you from feeling different? But I did feel different, I said, my voice rising. I felt different every single day because you let Kevin make me feel different. Every time he reminded me I wasn't real family, every time he told me I should be grateful, every time you stood by and let it happen, you were enabling abuse based on a lie you created. Dad broke down completely then, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from 30 years of buried guilt. We're so sorry, Clarisse. We thought it would be easier for everyone if Kevin never knew the truth about his parentage. Easier for who? I demanded, because it certainly wasn't easier for me. James, who had been quietly supportive throughout the explosion, finally spoke up. The damage is done, he said simply. The question now is whether this family can find a way to move forward with the truth. I looked around the table at the people who had raised me, who had loved me imperfectly, who had made choices that protected one child at the expense of another. The anger was still there, burning hot and justified, but underneath it was something else. Relief. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I stood in this family. I was not the grateful outsider anymore. I was their daughter, biologically and completely, and no one could ever take that away from me again. I said finally, Kevin needs to know the whole truth. He deserves to understand why his identity was built on a lie, just like I deserve to know why mine was. Mom nodded through her tears. We'll tell him everything. We should have done this years ago. The Thanksgiving dinner was ruined. The family dynamic forever changed. But as I sat there surrounded by broken dishes and broken secrets, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I belonged exactly where I was. The truth had set me free, even if it had destroyed everything else in the process. 3 months after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I stood in the kitchen of the house on Maple Street, helping Mom prepare Sunday lunch. The familiarity of the task felt different now, not like a grateful outsider earning her place, but like a daughter participating in her own family's traditions. The changes hadn't come easily. Kevin had disappeared for 6 weeks after learning the truth, refusing phone calls and ignoring text messages. When he finally surfaced, it was through a therapist's office where he'd been working through 30 years of constructed identity and misplaced anger.
I need to apologize, he'd said during our first mediated conversation. His voice hollow but genuine. Not just for Thanksgiving night, but for everything. For 30 years of making you feel like you didn't belong when I was the one living a lie. The apology was a start, but healing required more than words. Kevin had to confront not just his treatment of me, but his own identity crisis. Learning that his entire sense of self had been built on deception while watching me discover my true place in the family had shattered him in ways that would take years to fully address. I think part of me always knew, he admitted during one of our sessions. Deep down, I think I knew something wasn't right about my place in this family, and I took it out on you instead of asking the hard questions. Family therapy became a weekly ritual. Dr. Martinez, the same professor who taught me that genetics tells stories, recommended a colleague who specialized in family systems and adoption trauma. Those sessions were brutal, forcing all of us to confront 3 decades of dysfunction and misplaced protection. Mom and Dad's marriage nearly didn't survive the truth. The secret that had supposedly protected their relationship actually poisoned it, creating layers of guilt and resentment that required professional help to unravel. Dad moved out for 2 months while they worked through the betrayal and deception that had shaped their entire marriage. I thought I was protecting everyone, Dad said during one particularly difficult session. Kevin from knowing about the affair, Linda from the shame of infertility, you from feeling different. Instead, I created a situation where everyone was hurt. The hardest part was learning to navigate relationships without the familiar dynamics we'd all grown accustomed to. Kevin had to find his identity beyond being the real son who tormented the adopted daughter. Mom and Dad had to learn how to parent without the guilt and overcompensation that had driven their choices for decades. And I had to figure out how to be their biological daughter without completely abandoning the independence and resilience that had sustained me through years of feeling like an outsider. James had been my anchor throughout the chaos. He'd watched my family implode and rebuild, offering steady support without trying to fix what wasn't his to fix. When Kevin made genuine efforts to change his behavior, James encouraged my cautious optimism. When I struggled with forgiving parents who had enabled years of emotional abuse, he reminded me that healing didn't require forgetting. You get to decide what family means to you now, he said one evening as we walked around Lake Calhoun, the same lake where I'd wrestled with the decision to investigate my origins months earlier. Biology doesn't automatically create healthy relationships, and neither does adoption. Family is what you build it to be. The work was ongoing. Kevin's genuine remorse didn't immediately erase 30 years of cruelty, and my parents' explanations didn't immediately heal 30 years of feeling like an outsider in my own home. But for the first time, we were building relationships on truth, instead of carefully constructed lies. Dr. Sarah Kim had been right. Genetic relationships are just biology, but family is much more complicated than DNA. The test results had given me scientific proof of my place in the Johnson family tree, but the real work was learning how to belong emotionally in a family that was finally ready to be honest with itself. 6 months later, at Kevin's birthday dinner, something had fundamentally shifted. When he raised his glass for a toast, there was no mockery in his voice, no cruel reminder of supposed gratitude I should feel. To family, he said simply, meeting my eyes across the table. To the messy, complicated, imperfect people who love each other despite everything. I raised my glass in return, feeling the weight of genetic truth and emotional healing combining into something that finally resembled peace. To family, I agreed, however we define it. Looking back, I realized that the DNA test had given me more than scientific proof of my biological relationships. It had given me permission to claim my place, to stop apologizing for existing, to build the family connections I deserved rather than settling for the scraps I'd been offered. The truth had been worth every uncomfortable conversation, every difficult session, every moment of watching our carefully constructed family narrative crumble. Because what we built in its place was real, messy and imperfect, but real in a way it had never been before. I was finally home, in every sense that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.